Okay. All right. Okay. How's my sense of things? All right. Well, yes, and I guess it could be considered a great adventure to draw out from one's own thought and what one remembers of the times which were formative to one, and then to like realize, oh, as you grow more and more familiar with what you are remembering and imagining in your own mind, you begin to realize, oh, this is what I've been doing all along. I have been building a picture of the world from what I've seen and from what I've heard and what I've overheard and from what I've read and what I've thought about, what I've dreamed of, what I've expected or what I've been concerned about, what has come about and what has not come about, and how I felt about it all and all the reactions that I've had. I have been building a world. And I expect that's something that could be felt by everyone, at least at some point in their life, if not always. And so, with that in mind, we can begin to approach then um, the work of a particular individual whose thought has become exemplary of so much of what we constellate as our times, and what also is what we feel in ourselves as something we know or come to know or would like to come to know. And in other words, our thought. So there are those, the individual I'm speaking of, Hannah Arendt, whose body of work consists of reflections over time upon many, many subjects involving the events that were current to her before her very eyes, and events that she experienced herself in oh so direct and oh so indirect ways, and what she found worth it to become committed to or to get involved in, you see. And this fed into her sense of what was real and what was true. And this in turn fed into the works that she continued to produce in response to those times. And, in seeing into the nature of those times and herself as she writes about it, and expressed in so many ways in such a rich variety of language. So much so that she is quite well known. What I hope to offer here is just a little bit of a little peep into her work, and maybe in the course of it all, if my attention, is ready, and if yours is also in the right way of things, you see, and if it's not too difficult and yet not too easy either, we can arrive at somehow later on at a greater inkling of familiarity with such a work of such resonating importance, you see, to be considered like classical, which is why it's under our consideration now. Involving the 20th century. Think of her lifespan. Hannah Arendt was born in 1906 in Königsberg, or maybe in Hanover, but her family on both sides were from Königsberg, which is where Kant was from, and imbued with the spirit of that place in such a way, even from that time, and you would even speak about it in the way that you would speak about the connection that Kant, the great philosopher, had with that city. You see, being involved in it all in terms of his mind. So this is how Hannah Arendt also related to the world. It's a certain kind of like type of intellect, you might say. And they came from the same sense of place, you see. Oh, but such vastly different times. Hannah Arendt's family, when she was about 6 or so, they were forced to flee Königsberg and had to get to Berlin quickly to be safe because of the threat of advancing Russian forces in, I think it was 1913. And which was also the same year that her father passed away, when she was about 6 or so, 7 or so. And they fled to Berlin. And she began to be schooled, I think. Eventually they came back to Königsberg, I think. So her primary schooling was probably in Königsberg. And she was... The seeds of learning offered even from that age fell upon ready soil, so that her skills and her talents and her abilities were recognized. And even from that point, she began to build on her understanding, so that times went on, and she began to, read voraciously, and in philosophy and in theology as well, and all kinds of theology, with a passionate interest. And by passionate, I mean an interest that just does not have to be studied to be brought about, but just comes from within in such a with such a force that it spontaneously, that will and the attention is just very much interested in it. And it was this kind of mind that we can see from the very beginning starting to develop. And so eventually, of course, she goes to, from Berlin, she goes to Marburg, the university there. And now, she is in, these are the college years, you might say, we might say here in America. And she's in Marburg, and with a mind already so open and receptive to the influence of so many inspired thinkers before, that it was inevitable, I guess you might say, if we're talking about the trajectory of a unique writing life, you might say that it was inevitable that she would meet up with someone who exemplified for her and brought forth from her, which, educe, the root of educate means, educe means to bring forth. Like a tree brings forth a blossom, like a tree brings forth a fruit out of the life with which is inside of it. And the fruit and the blossom that the tree brings forth is always uniquely related to the kind and the type of the tree it is, you see. So, and to understand trees in this way, what must happen in the life cycle of the tree. You know what must happen, and yet you know not what may happen. You know well what must happen, and you know not what may happen. Well, so as if it was something fated, as if it was something foretold, as if it was something seen before in a dream, Hannah Arendt met Martin Heidegger. And in each, it seemed, Heidegger was, he was older. I mean, he was 37 or something, and she was in her early 20s. And so, if you want to see it as like a love story, and it is, you can see all the different parts in it and everything that we bring to such a love story, which is part of what makes her life so exemplary in the way that it is, because you can bring to it all of the concerns that you bring out of your own relation to your own times. And then even, I guess, this is what happens. This is how we appreciate stories of this nature. We might project our own net of unreflected conclusions and draw strange, stale, yet stimulating conclusions about the nature of life or about the nature of relationships or such. And you can, and they do apply, because all relationships of this nature, their flaw is one of the things that makes them interesting. And so Hannah Arendt met Martin Heidegger so that we can look at that now and kind of interpret what it might mean. And so I think that for, in one sense, I just want to say something about Martin Heidegger as a thinker of a similar depth of gift, of something about the guiding star of a certain kind of expressionistic, philosophical, contemplative, and yet, far-reaching feeling, thinking seems to like shine from the sky, and rays of that star seem to land at the feet of both Hannah Arendt and Martin Heidegger. So it's just like this. Heidegger at that time, well, he was formulating his challenging and creative philosophy. And he was delivering it in these classroom lectures while he was like dressed in not lederhosen, thank goodness, but knickerbockers in some kind of like Bavarian style sports coat. And there was something about Heidegger. Well, he's speaking in koans. He's speaking in riddles. He's speaking in non sequiturs. He's speaking in neologisms and new coinages, and yet he's bringing up classical words, especially classical words from the Greek. And he is presenting them to you as if they were empty stages. And then, as if no one is really there, something happens. As if no one is really there, as if to say that what is happening actually is happening in language, but language is nothing but a house. Language is nothing but a house in which lives being, you might say. Language sets the conditions. Language opens the door to being. And so what Heidegger was doing in his classroom was putting together and taking apart and putting together and taking apart and putting together and taking apart and putting then into conundrums and seemingly sayings and just portents, portents, which he would leave there like a thought bubble full of everything and nothing and step back. And that was how he taught his philosophy. And Hannah Arendt, she got it. To use the slang word, she got it like somebody will look at the pattern of a bumblebee and see the line it is making and understand that line in its formation as it expresses its lineness. Actually means something that she herself has long sought to understand. And so it became this intense kind of like legendary thing as if lifted out of time. She always referred to Heidegger's commitment to thinking as like what passionate thinking. It was just, it was for the first time to hear presented before you actual nature of what it was you were doing in your mind. This is what Heidegger provided for her, a great gift, poetically. And she responded as if to say, my intellect, is brought forth. Everything that I've wanted to understand, I see reflected in another. The kinds of truths that are available and possible for humans to understand are those that are brought forth. The thoughts that can be brought forth into the space between us. These are the thoughts that we can verify to see if they are real or not. And in out loud language I have heard spoken in coming from the mouth of a teacher who knows something no one else knows, Martin Heidegger, I see that in you. And so together their romance became the furtherance of their own art of thinking. Their own art of thinking, and yet its own dramatic and characterological arc, its own trajectory, you see. So I wanted to say something about Heidegger. Heidegger, his father was worked as a sexton, took care of the bells in the bell tower of a village church in Bavaria. They were Catholic. They came from a stock that was close to the earth, you might say. And something, I would submit to you, I would represent to you that Martin Heidegger would walk or stand, and in the gloaming, in the dusk, the sound of a church bell would ring out. And for Martin Heidegger, such a sound and a space was like an open haiku, like a haiku moment. As the haiku artist, I think it was Basho, said, the temple bells have stopped, but the sound keeps coming out of the flowers. I think that for Martin Heidegger, the disclosure of what there was in language, which it could express and what it could not express, came to him in the form of this interior dwelling space, which at a fortunate or formative moment, or a daemonic moment, at an inevitable moment for the type of thinker that he was, as well as Hannah Arendt, a space was created in actual experience that he became the interpreter of as part of his life's task. And so imagine a bell ringing in a small country church, but with a tower. Imagine going up the towers at some time and going up the staircase. And I would love to think that it would be a spiral staircase, but it probably wasn't. It was probably from platform to platform, like the staircases in church towers usually are when they're built in this part of the world at this time. Nevertheless, up there is the vast workings of the bell, even when it is not ringing, but the sense of the vastness of it, and yet the hollowness of it, and the heaviness of it, and the rude crudeness of it. It's not a refined metal. But it is not the refinedness of the metal or the unrefinedness of the metal that makes for the way the sound is. It's the hollow space within. It is the interior space within. And imagine that your Martin is a child and you're looking at the silent bell up there in the tower and you're thinking about this. And there's nothing but you and that in the world. But then you feel a hand on your shoulder. His father's hand was laid upon his shoulder. He looked up. And in that moment, I think Martin Heidegger felt, the familial connection, the warm, familiar closeness of someone near him who knew not to disturb him when he was concentrating, who knew that Martin was, it's just like the Walt Whitman poem, there was a child went forth, the Walt Whitman poem that talks about there was the child went forth and everything that saw, everything that child saw, that child became, and that thing became that child. And it goes on and it, notates all the things of the day, that Walt Whitman poem. Well, it would be like that with Martin Heidegger looking at the bell, and then his father's hand is laid upon his shoulder. And that moment, too, has that element of human otherness, you see. A memory of an inner, family image that when Martin Heidegger was a university professor, and when the inspirations that became his philosophy and his expression of it in the academic world, in the education world, I mean to say, because truly this is teaching, and yet it's also academics, and that's that's where kind of he gets led astray, but well, you could express it in that way, but that moment, of familial togetherness was brought into the situation of a university professor at a certain time. This is the late 1920s and the early 1930s in Germany. So by certain time, we don't need to refer to much, but something, huge, that was happening. And Martin Heidegger was an ambitious academic at that time, you see. But within him, you see, there was something that just, the peace of mind that came to him that he needed to formulate his thoughts at their very impetus were not available to him in the university setting with all of its fractured rivalries. Not to mention his nature, his path led him away from the kind of the Jesuit layout that was put before him originally, in which his talents were first recognized, in which his path was opened into that world. And yet there came a time when he had to break with what would be expected from him to be a priest. A Jesuit, I believe, they're the ones who kind of sponsor or fostered his education. Well, he had to break with that. And so the alienation of that, the defamiliarization of that, you see, and the heaviness of the bad things that were happening in German culture, with some of which he was pulled in the direction of. Without the silent place which was his domicile, it was hard for Heidegger to continue to adhere with such intensity to his moral compass, you see. So that, as is common knowledge, and is becoming more so all the time when we think about it, look at it, we still are coming to understand what it actually all means. And we'll have to talk about that more. Hannah Arendt contributes to that in so many ways too. The continuing understanding of what it all means, what was happening in the 20th century is what I mean, And so Martin Heidegger had a very temporary, but in no way superficial, connection with the Nazi Party, and was a party member, and actually attained to the rectorship, either at Marburg or at Freiburg or Heidelberg. I get them all. A rectorship in a university, in Germany, and it was during the time when he was most identified with the Nazi Party. So, at the same time, of course, Hannah Arendt was continuing her education, and she was in places like Freiburg and Heidelberg and attending the lectures of the great Edmund Husserl, the phenomenologist that Martin Heidegger actually repudiated because of Martin Husserl was a Jew. But it wasn't quite as bad as what people think that Martin Heidegger did. He actually signed a circular that was going around. I mean, it was bad, but nevertheless, Husserl continued to lecture, and Hannah Arendt sat in for a whole semester of lectures with him. And at the same time, she was continuing on in her education. And for a time, she was deeply involved in her thinking with the German Romantic tradition. And I want to mention another thing about Heidegger now, literarily, and Hannah Arendt fully understands this, but it's like her daemon is calling her to be a more social kind of writer. That's going to be the milieu upon which her conceptual poetic works take place. Whereas for Heidegger, it's a very esoteric root. It's deeply rooted in a dense place far from human habitation. It's that kind of thought. And this is one of the very important features that one can appreciate about German Romanticism, because it has a deep regard for that kind of esoteric thinking, as well as, it has a great utopian and insightful and poetic regard for some kind of like imagined union or imagined synthesis of science and philosophy and poetry. And such things, inform the works of such mystical writers as Novalis. That's when I'm talking about German Romantics. A figure like Novalis readily comes to mind, who exemplifies all these kind of things. And also an awareness of the value of the more ancient forms of language, of storytelling, of archaic literary expression, of primordial, original literary expression, the fairy tale, the allegorical language, the language also of the people close to the earth, those whose inner lives follow the arc of the germinating seed, of the embodied seed, of the life cycle of the plant and the tree as they bring forth fruit and as they bring forth blossoms and as they live their invisible lives within themselves. But we come to foster it as people of the earth. You see, all of this is like German Romantic talk, right? And so Hannah Arendt's connection with Heidegger, was so deeply foundationed in that kind of language, so that Hannah Arendt was passionately understanding. This probably was her way of just imbibing the essence of all of these different kind of writers and what they meant to her in terms of her own experience and what she had seen. And what had been brought forth from her in her work with Martin Heidegger, you see. But at the same time, somewhere along this time, Hannah Arendt's and Martin Heidegger's, surreptitious romantic, relationship had kind of like cooled, and kind of things kind of were settled more. For a while, it was a risky thing for both of them, and it's such deep meaning for the both of them, you see. And but there's more to it than the soap opera, which I'm trying to allude to now. There was actually understanding that would continue to go on because of this intellectual kinship, which was more than intellectual, which included their own maturation as thinkers. And they were both deeply involved in that because they had both inspired each other so much, that Hannah Arendt would continue to revisit Heidegger, and be in contact with him and to dialogue with him about all the bad things, about Heidegger, about the Nazism and about, so many things, and yet still value their relationship. And it's just a great to understand this, even though it was sort of a secret that Martin Heidegger and Hannah Arendt had been a romantic, scene at that time. It wasn't known, I don't think, until the 1980s or so. It came out in a biography. But of course, the two of them, they agreed together to keep it all secret, but to save and put together all their correspondence, the letters they wrote to each other, and then at the due time to allow that to go into the world. See, they knew how to tell their story, and it's told in those kind of like letters. It's because these are thinkers they're like musicians, to hear what they really have to say, you got to put the instrument into their hands and let them play it, you see. And this was, we still have a living image of that in their letters. And so they made sure that we would, because they understood the meaning of their relationship, even though it was so fraught at that time. Anyway, so as Hannah Arendt as Germany continues to deteriorate, in the early 1930s, and even as Hannah Arendt understands, because she's Jewish, if I haven't mentioned already, and understands herself in a certain way, and the way that others see her, in this kind of sense where, these things that were not things that I'd just taken for granted, really, are now appearing all around me in the form of actions and edicts and rules and changes in the political structure of things. And suddenly I'm realizing, I am not that, even though the language and the philosophy of this culture is the language and philosophy of my soul. Even then I see something that's very destructive and alien coming out of that. And yet, is it all that alien? And she begins to understand herself in that way. And so then her attention is caught by the daughter of the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn, I think Anna Mendelssohn, a great friend of Hannah Arendt, gave her access to the correspondence of Rahel Wernhagen, who about 100 years before Hannah Arendt lived. She lived, I can't tell you for sure if it was in Vienna or Berlin, but she was Jewish, and she had a deeply passionate and unique understanding of communication of one's thoughts, and the necessity to communicate one's thoughts and bring them into proximity with others, so that the truth that can only be realized in proximity with others, you see, are the truth that we can come close to in our essence. That which we nourish, we can be nourished by, if we bring it into the spaces which are meant for it to be, the spaces of human communication, you see, of human thought, which is what are politics. And by politics, Hannah Arendt meant specifically like people, and what brings people together, and the spaces that people can inhabit together to express their thoughts in all the dimensions that thoughts can be expressed, and also to form alliances and make promises and compacts and organizations and structures of authority and understanding and resources and education lessons, to put those all together, you see. And this involves politics, you see. Anyway, Rahel Wernhagen was, without the social connections, well, she had some social connections, I suppose, because she facilitated a salon, kind of a gathering, and perhaps a community, which is a very European thing, but that's a certain way where ideas can be nourished. And Rahel Wernhagen did that in, I think it was her letters that Hannah Arendt was able to draw upon. And for herself, she began to commune with the spirit of Rahel Wernhagen, not like in, a seance or something like that, not like that, but thought to thought, the livingness of the thought, to thought. She saw the same inspiration in another writer, and gave the gift back, so to speak, to bring awareness of this writer forward into public consciousness, so that what needs to be made known can be made known in the only way such things are made known, with this kind of work, with this kind of literary work. And so, for some reason then, for Hannah Arendt, Oh, and so she knew that Martin Heidegger was attending Nazi meetings, and she asked him about it. Are you doing this, and with some evasiveness, you see, because that was where what kind of made Martin Heidegger such a compelling kind of lecturer, in his slant ways take on words, like, Heraclitus, gone, into dimensions of his own discovery. Well, for Hannah Arendt, oh, talking about that in that way. Um, for Hannah Arendt, that writing, as great as it is, there's something in it that is happening that I see reflected around me. And it's even manifested in Martin Heidegger's um, fellow traveling with the Nazis, even becoming a party member, you see, which he was. There's something there that is a lack of engagement, that shows a lack of actual authentic engagement with the world, as the appropriate place for your own thoughts to go. Instead, at some crucial time, the thoughts fall back into themselves, sometimes along their own kind of structures that are very, craftily, very beautifully put together, and yet they don't make it fully out into the light that can only exist between people. And so something is lost, and then it is still acted on. It becomes these other alliances that seem to poison and make difficult or impossible, well, progressively difficult, and then finally impossible, inevitably, to make it even possible for people to find the spaces of engagement where they can come together and share their thoughts. Because once those kind of structures are disrupted by, a malicious agent or an action of ignorance, or somebody gets too excited, you cannot, the causes, I suppose, are endless, as are the excuses. And yet, it seems to be that what is happening is, a lapse in thought, a lapse in the need to think, as Hannah Arendt would put it, has a lapse in the need to think has resulted in a collapse or decay of the structures we maintain by which we come together to share our thoughts. And what appears in the place of those collapsing structures are the malevolent kind of political doctrines and ideologies, you see. And they have a certain kind of structure and form, which later on in the 1950s she would begin to realize, and then she would take the term from Mussolini, who used it somehow, and I don't know how, but it is said that Hannah Arendt took this term, totalitarianism, from Mussolini's speeches somewhere. And for her, this became the way she crafted an illustration of the way that she thought, a way to understand what had happened in the Nazi times, and also a way to understand what had happened in the Stalin times. And for her, and it's still something we seem to be coming to terms with because of our own, what dare I say it, biases, I'm not sure, but because of her time dates, you see, the First World War and the Soviet Revolution, for her, was actually the beginning of the incipient time of this new form of totalitarian government, which developed over time along lines of inevitability. And then came what happened in Germany, which she was so face-to-face and intimately related with, as she saw happening all around her in her formative young adult years. And to see that both of these things had this kind of all-enveloping quality about them that drove them to not just, it wasn't just authoritarianism exactly, or tyranny. Of course, it includes all of that. But there's something else that is happening in totalitarianism, and that is when the spaces between people by which they can bring their thoughts are destroyed. In their place is put then violence, not power. For her, power was concerted action. And violence and power were actually not the same at all. But this was difficult. This and still is difficult for people to understand, that there are so many elegant and telling and startling insights, that come to us out of her writing. Anyway, this is what was happening all around. And so when Martin Heidegger said to her he was attending Nazi meetings, but his feelings for her had not changed. Well, this is difficult, and because, they understood each other even then, but of course, so many things were happening. Eventually, of course, Hannah Arendt fled Germany and fled to France and did important work with Jewish cultural restoration and with repatriating youths and orphans and children to the British mandate to get them out of Nazi Germany before the bad things that continued to be happening and got worse. Well, she was working there in France to do all of this, and then when France fell, she was able to make it through. I don't think it was Marseille. I think it was the other way, but eventually to Portugal, through the south of France into Portugal, and then from there to America. And then she was at New York City in the New School of Research, and she became a teacher there for generations of students, helping us all to understand. And she never accepted like tenured positions, of course, because there's a certain freedom that would that she needed to have so that the thoughts that were her own were created, outside the context of any kind of like social pressure or pressure for to achieve like promotion along some academic hierarchy. It wasn't that. She didn't need to, I suppose, because she already had this reputation. I mean, considering who all that she associated with, and I've only touched on a little part of all the great thinkers that she was associated with and carried on and learned from in such an inspired way. But anyway, so somehow when she turned from Rahel Wernhagen when she turned from German Romanticism and where that kind of poetic, introverted kind of style goes, at least the way that she was seeing the needs of herself and the needs of the time. When she turned to the writings of Rahel Wernhagen, it was like, it became so very, very formative in where she needed to do her work. And so this was one of her early publications. And then also along about this time, under the supervision of the great Karl Jaspers, who was everything that Heidegger was not, in terms of someone of great humanitarian understanding, and who stayed in Germany and was able to speak against the Nazis, and was married to a Jewish wife, and they both survived, and went on to have a distinguished career. Such, everything that Martin Heidegger, in a way that was flawed, she found it in other teachers something that was like the healing of that, you see? But learning from them all, by learning from them. This was how she related to people in this very creative way. And so Karl Jaspers was her, as well as the author of the great book of correspondence, which that kind of publications continue to come out from Hannah Arendt's writings, which are voluminous and continue to be published long after she passed away in 1975. And anyway, her supervisor for this work that she did, and I wanted to mention it, was she did her habilitation, is that what you call it, on St. Augustine, on the concept of love in St. Augustine, a philosophical look into the concept of love of St. Augustine. And this becomes like an illustration of what was happening in her thought, or what was creatively being brought forth along her road of thought. And it involved, I guess, how do you even begin to express it? Well, it involves the will. She called St. Augustine the philosopher of the will. And it goes something like this, when we speak of the will in a thinker such as St. Augustine, when we speak of the will, we begin to speak of such things as choice and freedom and free choice. And then when we think of the word for free choice, the word for choice in Greek, which is I don't remember, there's a word in Greek for choice. But there's something that is her contemporary experience of her own self in her own times. There was something unprecedented in what her understanding needed to discover, involving this notion of choice and will, and she couldn't find it in the classical Greek explanations of will. It seems that for her, and she adhered closely to the history and the meaning of the words. Yes, she rested and she worked in the meaning of the words. This makes her, a bit of a poet, does it not? Of course it does. She was very much inspired by poets. She wrote, her and her first husband, Gunther Stern, wrote about Rilke. Maybe we'll talk about that. She thought of Rilke as kind of a contemporary Augustine, actually. But let's get back to St. Augustine and the will. And so what Hannah Arendt did not see in the Greek concept of the will was, or of free choice, was that for the Greeks, free choice was really just the further coming into being of something that was preordained. Be it a good choice or a bad choice. You made that choice, but in making that choice, you were just bringing forth simply something that was preordained from the very start, you see, because for Hannah Arendt, in the meaning of the words, she found it to be like, for the Greeks, they had like a cyclical view of time, which was not how Hannah Arendt was experiencing time, and perhaps not how we are experiencing time, not exactly. I mean, we can imagine and put ourselves in that imaginative place, and so she must have done that herself to be able to understand, but to see what was needed, was to set aside that Greek notion of time, which presupposed that there's this inevitable arc, that all things have good or bad, and yes, we do choose them, but in doing so, it's something that is just already there. But for St. Augustine, well, consider in time his sense, the future. For St. Augustine, the future is something in our minds which comes out of our minds, and in that sense, then, when we think about something that is preordained or foreordained or just part of an inevitability, just because we say inevitability doesn't mean we're talking about something preordained. And just because we say something is preordained doesn't mean that it's a certain kind of inevitability, that kind of stoical inevitability that I think that the Greek sense of choice seems to suggest. Well, for St. Augustine, it wasn't happening that way. The future was just this thing that was, it was a thing of the mind, but the response to it was like this. Even in all choices, in all conflicts, within oneself about what is good and what is bad. St. Augustine, of course, spent a wayward and profligate youth, and yet his mind was working even then. And so this notion of choice is very important when we understand the life trajectory of a thinker like St. Augustine, as we're sort of coming to an understanding, a preliminary inkling of the life arc and trajectory of a thinker such as Hannah Arendt. But for this other one that I'm talking about, for St. Augustine, it's this notion of the will and this notion of choice, this notion of the future, of good and bad. His famous, prayer, which is a formula. It's very good. It's a poem in and of itself, which is, Lord, make me good, but not yet. This St. Augustine is the one who uttered that one. And so this notion, not yet, it presupposes the future, right? Does it not? And but this brings such a conflict. It brings such a conflict into the unknown parts of ourself, which is where the conflict is brought and comes down so heavy between this, because it's the will. It's the will. We command ourselves to do the right thing. God, make me good, but not yet. We command ourselves to do the right thing, and we rebel against our own command. Something in us brings this conflict into sharp consciousness, you see. And it's the future coming at us and the choices that we make about what is right or wrong. And then suddenly there comes into being almost like two notions at war with each other. The I will and the I nil. This is how St. Augustine put it, kind of drawing from the Latin in which I believe the book was written. I will and I nil. Yes and no, actually. It's all it is. Just the acute pain that we feel between yes and no. And so this is where St. Augustine, after, the course of his life, continued to accrue to itself, the good And when he became Bishop of Hippo, and he was delivering a sermon on the first epistle of St. John, the 4th chapter, St. Augustine was delivering this sermon. It's among his writings. Hannah Arendt paid close attention to it. St. Augustine says something to the effect, well, not St. Augustine, but St. John. St. John says, no one has seen God. No one has seen God. But God so loved us as to give us a measure of his Spirit. We cannot see God, but when we love others to whom God has also given a measure of his Spirit, for God also loves them in the same way. And when we see that and bring that forth in each other, when we hold each other in that kind of awareness, that is when we come to understand the nature of God, because we are working out of the measure of what God has brought to being in us as ourselves, as our neighbor. You see, love thy neighbor as thyself. This is what's happening there. So that you may realize, as Hannah Arendt might put it, the living light in the spaces between you. See, so for Hannah Arendt, part of her conception, so mythical and so rich and so sublime, was that, yes, there are these spaces between ourselves, and we bring our inspiration and our creativity. You see, we bring our attention, we bring our undivided attention into those spaces and create structures and create thoughts, or create works of art, or create, political structures, so as to continue to make it possible and to enrich its practice. Promises. Hannah Arendt speaks of promises as being very much a part of what is happening in politics when we build those structures in those spaces. And we make compacts and we make promises, which is an intention to bring along what is agreed upon as being something that's mutually worth it. And so that, one steps into time, so to speak, with what one is working to develop in the spaces between. Loving thy neighbor as thyself, you see, a mutual recognition of the common value of certain things that are good, that are true, that are beautiful. You see, this is how these forms of democratic structure in Hannah Arendt, one of the things, and you could express them actually through any other thinker who was inspired by Hannah Arendt. Yeah, of course that, but no, through any other thinker who inspired Hannah Arendt. Each one, she's like a mandala, and each road from the preceding thinkers to her can build upon certain aspects of her thought, and we see this even now when we consider, the nature of her characterization, or the thought picture that she brings us of St. Augustine, which, one can attend to and learn from, and then relate it kind of like a story or something, And so, yeah, the conflicted will in St. Augustine, yet loving thy neighbor as thyself, as being what you can do to come to understand the God that you cannot see. And how strange it is that you realize that's the space, the religious space, and it's an open one, because the measure that is spoken of is not something that can be seen with the eyes, nor known in like a stale kind of way. We must think in order to come to know what is true, in order to come into right relationship with each other. We must. Oh, but sometimes we don't, right? So what better time than to talk about Adolf Eichmann? Sometimes we think, and sometimes we don't. Yeah. It's like is said, we are still undergoing an arduous examination, from the watchful gods, about what have we really understood, about the 20th century and what happened in the 20th century and what it means for us now in terms of political structures and the different things that can happen in them, in the kind of the dynamic nature of them. What have we learned from that because of the cataclysms of the 20th century? What has been learned? And Hannah Arendt experienced it oh so intimately, like the whole world did at that time. But for her, it was like one whose life is to be lived in thought, and one whose work in the world is to be expressed in terms of thought, such as Hannah Arendt, one who is this way, begins to hear the news of what was happening in Germany now that the war has ended. And then there's all of this information about factories of death, about places where people were brought for the sole purpose of being stripped of all human mutual regard, so that to be killed, but not just physically, but also spiritually. How is one to understand such a thing? And at first, Hannah Arendt, the vocabulary was there for her, but she was going to go into it and find out, what was to be in there that was going to be able to address the novel situation. It was her work to do that. And so in Kant, she found Kant talking sometimes, expressing or writing about a notion of evil, but not the evil of ignorance or the evil of mistaken notion, but of radical evil, as Kant said. Radical evil, radical in the sense that its redux, its root is in evil motivation. Its cause, its sole cause, and its energy is in evil motivation, radical evil, evil at the root. And yet, that's just the start of it, really, because what this here has happened is something that so defies all understanding. We simply cannot take the understanding that has been defied and just prop it up again. It would be like propping up a puppet or something. We've got to think, and we've got to come to understand what's really happening there. This evil, embodied in someone like Adolf Eichmann, who was like the supervisor, the CEO of the transit whole system that transported the trains and coordinated the trains, to the death camps. When he was finally apprehended in 1960 or so and brought to Israel for trial, this was around when Hannah Arendt was at the New School, and she heard about this, and something began to crystallize in her mind. It's crystals that Hannah Arendt's thoughts take. Systematically, you can interpret it in a great many systematic ways, but to actually feel, how her thoughts work, to my mind at least, is to understand them as these crystallizations around these key themes, and then it lights up the connection between these other themes. So for Hannah Arendt, thinking about Kant, about radical evil, and about what was happening in the factories of death, and then she suddenly began to contemplate this figure of Eichmann. And a great many other questions began to enter her mind. She did not go into the mind of Adolf Eichmann. She did not look for causes or excuses or whatever in the past of Adolf Eichmann. It wasn't like she was looking for just a mere psychological portrait, because that would not do. The time of psychological portraiture is defied by such a novel expression of utter evil as a factory of death. So what is it then about Eichmann that we can come to understand and perhaps see, a way into the whole, to bring understanding into the space between us? This cataclysmic thing is kind of, you might say, demolished how we can think of the space between us now, that such a thing can happen. So to restore it, to bring light to it, we have to strengthen our understanding and try to see where we are called in what we're trying to understand. And for her, what is the meaning of what Adolf Eichmann did. And so, she spent a lot of time in Jerusalem. She spent a lot of time at the trial, and she noted and she thought, she contemplated. And for her, it began to be that Adolf Eichmann is a new kind of criminal. Adolf Eichmann is not motivated by hate. We cannot say that he's like a psychotic, axe murderer. We cannot say that he's a hateful tyrant, actually. We cannot even say, Hannah Arendt said, that he is an anti-Semite. His mind isn't there when we look to identify it in those ways. What do we see instead? We see an individual whose conscience isn't there, so to speak. We see an individual, and then we see that individual as a reflection of the society. And what was happening in the entire society was a crime of such magnitude that to be normal morally would be the exception in such a society, and Adolf Eichmann was no exception. He was not exceptional, you see. Or maybe he had some ambition to rise in the Nazi hierarchy. She would sometimes say, it is of great political importance to understand at what moment an individual erases from their mind any notion of what constitutes a crime. It is very important politically, and then it is very important to note what happens after that. And she was able to locate a few timeline kind of events about that from Eichmann's own testimony, of Eichmann's own story, when it was in July 31st of 1941 that Reinhold Heydrich, one of the heads of the SS, informed Eichmann that the final solution has been set in place now. This is really something that's going to happen, and here's the blueprint, and we need people who are going to implement it. And that was in July 31st. And then for the next 4 weeks, Eichmann was in Poland, and he was seeing it beginning to happen, and he was seeing the actual death all around him. And he wrote at that time, he represented something to the effect of, I didn't like this. I did not like this. I did not like this death. But this death, all this death around me, I did not like this. But as Hannah Arendt tells us, September came, and it was, work time to get the transport going. And after that, it was all a matter of timetables. It was all a matter of, getting things on track, so to speak. And that was what it was all about. He could recite Kant's categorical imperative, like it is wrong to do something that you would not want others to do, that you could not see others as doing also, something to that effect. I'm not sure if I can recite it from memory, but Eichmann could. And yet, we do not see him asking himself, as Hannah Arendt explains to us, the very essential question, how could I live with myself if I did this? Because that was a question that never entered his mind. And that's where we get, the phrase by which we know her in common parlance, the banality of evil. We have Hannah Arendt who gave us that. And is now the time and place to note about that phrase, the banality of evil. How strange it is. We speak of evil as a quality, but when we speak of banal, that's a quality of people. And so it connects in our minds a quality of people with the existence of an actual vast abstract thing in such a way that, I guess that's one of the things about it that become memorable, you might say. But I'm not sure if you can just go intrinsically into that and put it that way. But I want to say instead, Heidegger, it's Heidegger's poetic sense of language, I think, that Hannah Arendt so learned from for her own poetic ear, so learned from in such a way that she could put together those phrases in that way to express this novel reality in such a way that, it becomes something that we remember to this day. But we've got to unpack it more, because already it is a cliche, and we fail such inspired ideas when we allow them to become cliches that we can repeat tritely and mindlessly. That would be a form of not thinking, right? And so we need to understand, what was it that she prefaced it with? She said the thought-defying banality of evil, the mind and thought-defying banality of evil. I want to find, because there was, just as much the banality of evil that was preceded by a huge sentence. And here's the sentence in the words of Hannah Arendt: "The lesson that this long course in human wickedness has taught us, the lesson of the fearsome, word and thought-defying banality of evil." The lesson of the fearful, word and thought-defying banality of evil. That is Hannah Arendt's lesson when we look into her teaching about Adolf Eichmann and his times of the banality of evil. And a different kind of criminal. We could go into it a lot. Hopefully I've said just a little bit of it. But I do want to say, earlier in her book, I think on the origins of totalitarianism, or maybe her book, The Human Condition, which she wrote before her book about Eichmann, which came out in 1962 or so. She wrote about, something to the effect of thoughtlessness is a characteristic of our time. Thoughtlessness, whether it's hopeless confusion or, trite repetition of cliched ideas, or stagnation of our notions such that we have a one-purpose-fits-all explanation of everything that's just like automatic and second nature to us and basically unconscious, are any actual sense of what is really happening, that kind of not thinking, non-thinking, unthinkingness, to be characteristic of our time. And then she saw it specifically manifested in specifically this way in Eichmann. And it's a notion, right, that we can still think about, and a personified kind of image of some kind of understanding that she was trying to get at, which is still in transit, which is still in transformation in us, in this, our examination of what is happening. What have we to learn in the 20th century, from the 20th century? What have we to learn of a long lesson in wickedness? Well, one is of the thought and word defying banality of evil, you see. And so, that being said, I want to come back a little bit to two things, maybe to go back and forth a little bit. Again, Hannah Arendt wrote a poetic prose piece during the time when things with Heidegger were very deeply, possessed by the romantic kind of inevitability of their involvement. And the writing is very poetic and very Heideggerian, but in a Hannah Arendt kind of way. And she speaks of the alienation and the fear of her childhood. You see, her father died from syphilis when she was 6, long about the time they were driven out of Königsberg, by the advance of the Russians at the same time. And that kind of alienation, and the sense of alienation from oneself, but also the language in Hannah Arendt's prose piece that she wrote, I think it's called Shadows. She also writes of, actually, the remarkableness of the banal. She writes of the awareness of alienation in the familiar and of the remarkable in the banal. And at least in translation, you see the word banal there. Really, it is this. And so these are some notes that I took that sort of I'm pretending that they're poems. And so this is about thinking in relation to Heidegger and Hannah Arendt, but a way to also to understand Heidegger in the way that the words that Heidegger presented to get his ideas across. The title is Thinking and Aliveness Are But One. Thinking and aliveness are but one. And it is only in those moments of great insight, you see, that is something that becomes true for us. Other times, those two ideas are far apart from each other. But in Heidegger and in Hannah Arendt, there are moments in our lives as we come to understand it, and in their lives too, when thinking and aliveness were one, which is why that's the title of this poem. But anyway, it goes, Heidegger's conception of truth, aletheia, This was his Greek word. Heidegger used a Greek word for truth, aletheia, and this is what it means. Heidegger's conception of truth, aletheia, unconcealedness, disclosure, revealing, unclosedness, right? Its antonym is lethe, L-E-T-H-E, oblivion, forgetfulness. Aletheia is disclosure, it is opening. Let me say also, another coinage of Heidegger's, which we can study, we can sink our teeth into, so to speak, and taste its tastelessness, is that Heidegger said something to the effect of nothingness in relation to all that seems to be is the veil of being. Nothingness in relation to all that seems to be is the veil of being. So in this sense, he presents it to us. Aletheia, truth, opening, revelation, disclosure. Aletheia is not a correspondence, like a state of affairs, or even coherence, like a statement of a system, taken as a whole. No, aletheia is how world is opened up. And to Heidegger, art gives things their look and humans their outlook. Another coinage of Heidegger's, art gives things their look and humans their outlook. Art speech, poetry, artworks, music, they are openings in which thought can take place, in which truth can appear, in which aletheia appears. Art clears the space for this. Poetic language, Heidegger would say, is the house of being. You see, he paid a lot of attention to Hölderlin. And we see in Hannah Arendt, we see Eichmann, announce yourself. And he does. And it's like, oh, okay, I get it, the banality of evil, And nevertheless, you see, this is poetic language at work, helping us to understand. And so that's something that can be said about Heidegger and about Hannah Arendt. Now, I want to say something about Hannah Arendt and some of these other things. I actually drawing it from St. Augustine a little bit. Let's go on doing that a little bit to understand the will in St. Augustine, and Hannah Arendt speaking of him as a philosopher of the will. We spoke of choice, and we spoke of for what's new and novel for Hannah Arendt in St. Augustine is choice for him is not the fulfillment of an inevitable trajectory. It is the experience of yes and no. And the pain of yes and no is experienced in the will, which is somehow just a doorway into an even deeper reality, the reality of the soul, you might say. And I did mention St. Augustine's sermon upon the first epistle of John and the content that was in there. And for St. Augustine, it has a very particular and important meaning, which I perhaps will attempt to contrast with that of St. Paul. For St. Paul, the conflict is between the flesh and the spirit. His coinage, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. This conflict. And for St. Paul, the drama in the spirit and in thinking is the emergence from this pain is in the gift of grace, which is given as like part of the nature, of God. And but St. Augustine is different, you see. And this too, why do we squander, our minds in imagining these social doctrinal differences between religion, which are only important sociologically, not politically in the sense that Hannah Arendt's talking about, because the great difference between these two thinkers, and we see that the great difference too is reflected in ourselves. So, for St. Paul, the drama is, the spirit and the flesh and it is resolved in the gift of grace. For St. Augustine, it is the dilemma, the contradiction, the pain is in the will, and the drama, the characters are the yes and the no, and what gives peace to the soul? What brings patience and endurance and steadiness to the will? It is when we realize that the will is free. We realize that the will as free is never something that obeys just as much. It is never something that is commanded. That's an illusion. It seems that way, but it is not. The will is not commanded. The will is not obeyed. It's not of that nature. The will is freedom. And as such, well, gotta quote William Blake sometime, energy is eternal delight. But the will is an energy, and it rises and it falls, and it moves and it speaks, and it hinders and it envelopes and it captures and it propels and it compels and it beckons. The will does and is all of this. So you can call it energy, and you can call it eternal delight, because it is where we feel love. Love would be that which gives peace to the will. Love would be that which takes in, like the pans of a scale, the yes and the no. Love is that which takes in the compulsion as well as the beckoning. All of these are part of the nature of the soul, and the soul is in freedom. So in trying to command it or to demand that it be a creature of obedience or of command, we live in pain until we accept its actual nature and realize it is there to abide in the peace that passes all understanding, the peace which includes, the absoluteness of the yes and the no, in their own way, and then can be embodied in the understanding. The weight, it is that which gives the soul weight. The educated will is that which gives the soul weight. The uneducated will is that which carries the soul into the fire without regard for the light that the fire gives. And the weight of the soul is what gives character, The weight of the soul comes down into the world of words and expresses itself in thought. And then there needs to be, right, in the spaces between people, there needs to be persons. And character, is expressed in this way in the spaces between people. Again and again, we come back to that, you see. Love each other in order to fulfill the nature of that which gives peace to your will, you see. And so, what does that say? Are you going to what are you going to say? That just, the notion of religion and stuff as being like a genre of dogmas is a secondary thing, Religious writing is the poetic language of the moral will in its relation to all other things. That's at least is the study of the good. And within those words, you find their roots. And so you don't have to worry, Hannah Arendt did not worry about that, about how it would, influence. She was independent, you see. It wasn't like a social movement was not the same as a political movement to her, She was looking, as she put it, for the grammar of action and the syntax of power. But that's not violence, you see. That's containers for the energy of the will that seeks that which gives it peace, which is to be in right regard to the things of the world, which are the relations between peoples as expressed in societies, and this is very good. So I was turning to this for some reason. Oh yeah, for some important reason. Here it is. So this also will give us kind of a bit of a rigmarole, but it shows how the thought can be like plowed back, into the language that is still there, the esoteric language, which is, for many of us, that's always going on too. When we learn to speak as babies, we babbled. Well, in a certain sense, we still do that. That train still rolls, but as we grow and mature, we realize that train too must carry some freight, And so anyway, so this is prelude to Brecht Testament. Let me just mention Bertolt Brecht was a good friend of Hannah Arendt's, and it's a good idea to remember that when Bertolt Brecht testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee in the late 1940s, this is before Joe McCarthy. This kind of gave Joe McCarthy, certain kind of impure ideas. But the House Un-American Activities Committee, that was during the days of the blacklist and all this. And you may be familiar with the Hollywood 19, Ring Lardner, Dalton Trumbo, and others who were summoned before the House Un-American Activities Committee. And they, maybe half of them answered questions. Well, no, they responded in some way, but only Bertolt Brecht of that group appeared before them and was questioned by some of these senators. And his answers couldn't help but be revelatory. His answers illustrate, I think, for us, the way that, art speech, is there to defy our notions, well, to educate us beyond our notions of what constitutes conventional notions of political misbehavior or error, in the way that he answered the questions, which basically were honesty, but honest in his way, So he was read... He was asked if he had ever been a revolutionary, if he had ever written against the government. And his answer to these people was that, yes, he had. He had been involved in writing against Hitler. He had been involved in writing against Hitler, as had they. But Bertolt Brecht was one who had to tell him, yes, I was writing against Hitler just as you were. You see. And so right away, he's establishing common ground in the space between them in a way that they do not expect. They expect that they're going to catch a communist. And he's telling them, I wrote against Hitler, and that was my revolutionary writings, which you take to mean evidence of communism. It was what is common between us. And, the senators didn't exactly know what to say. Well, they always know what to say. But, it was like, there's a moment where light appears in that, And Hannah Arendt also spoke of, light appears in times of darkness, sometimes not even in the form or less in the form of concepts and systems, but in the presence of human beings, like Bertolt Brecht before the House Un-American Activities Committee. And then they read a poem. Did you write this poem? And the poem was one of his, forward into the future, in solidarity we go. And so the poem, did you write this? And the senator's voice was rising with righteousness. And then he recited a portion of the poem. And Bertolt Brecht said, I wrote a poem in German, but it wasn't that. And the audience erupted in laughter, because it's funny and it's true. And he wasn't, he didn't mean to be funny. He was simply telling the truth, And then they asked him if he had ever been a member of the Communist Party, which he had not. That's like saying, if you're not formally affiliated with that, then how are you that thing that you are suspected to be? Well, that too, it just wasn't the expected answer. And for some reason, it still has meaning for me now, as it just sits there. And so this is so that's Bertolt Brecht. But here's a connection to Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt's written creations remind us she doesn't construe religion as some Marxian category. In democratic structures, we render unto neither God nor Caesar, especially Caesar as God. What I want to say with that, actually is when we create democratic structures, we are stepping away from, empire, of Roman times, We render it unto God what is God's, and we render unto Caesar what is Caesar. But that's said by a particular, author at a particular time for a particular group of people. But in terms of the actual, Roman model of citizenship, Caesar was God, you see. And so what is different about democracy from such a time as that is that as much as we derive in many ways or stem from or grow from Roman and Greek traditions of government, a key difference is Caesar is not God. And in that is a great truth about an inherent, unique and universal aspect of all of our democratic structures and spaces between people. You see, Caesar is not God, you know, and that's what I was trying to get at there. And Hannah Arendt then is able to say, therefore, actually from that, I would paraphrase Hannah Arendt, you know, as it's like the Marxists would say, you know, religion is another sociological category. Well, you know, I'm generalizing, of course, you know, but for Hannah Arendt, no, religion was not a category of something among other things like that, among other isms like that, because religion, its essence was revelation. Its essence was revelation, and there again we see Heidegger. You know, truth is aletheia. It is not a product of a systematic understanding of a correspondence of items. It is an opening. It is disclosure. It has no words for itself, except of what we work to bring forth as we approach an understanding of its true nature. You see, therefore, we cannot think of it in those kind of sociological terms. We cannot help but think of it in sociological terms these days because it's our own fault for not thinking clearly about it, you know. Always Hannah Arendt is summoning us, beckoning us. Sometimes in order to get at the meaning of what she's saying, even compelling us, you know, to grow more skilled in the work of thinking. As a Buddhist, she is a teacher of skillful means, you might say, which is, we got to work on this. Anyway, well, okay. So I've talked about that a little bit. So maybe it's time then to say something then toward the end as another point of departure. I spoke of, she was a social being, you know, in so many ways. And a great deal of her literary work does consist of correspondences with other great minds, Mary McCarthy, Karl Jaspers, Heidegger, a great many others. And her husband, Heinrich Blücher, is one of the great figures of the 20th century, and it is their mutuality between them that there's also a whole element, you know, of the greatness of both of them. And their letters are published, you know, it's titled, I think, Between Four Walls, you know, and it was their awareness of each other in their lives. Blücher, you know, was fantastic. He was a Berlin working class intellectual who didn't really have all as much secondary education as any of the others. And yet he produced great teaching works which were appreciated and understood and nourished the writings of people like Jaspers. They both share a certain notion of, like, I think, what do they call it? The sphere or the zone of resistance. And they both actualized it in many ways in their real lives, you know. But Blücher was a great teacher. And Blücher taught at Bard College and up there in the Hudson River Valley, and they both lived in New York. Hannah taught at New School of Social Research, and Heinrich Blücher taught at Bard College up there in the Hudson River Valley, you know. And it's just beyond words, you know. When I come to it at this point, you know, then I begin to realize, you know, we are dealing with, you know, along with Hannah Arendt, because of the nature of her gift, which is kind of like it has this social thing, we are suddenly introduced into a community of thinkers in a whole new way of exemplary 20th century thinkers who will help us to understand as we come to terms with the harsh lessons in our examination on this wicked century, the 20th, you know, century. And anyway, so here's a quote from Heinrich Blücher. And it's a lecture given at Bard College in 1967. And this stuff is actually online. God bless Bard College for making it available to us, You can listen to Blücher speak, because that was the form it took, because he was a teacher, like Socrates, like Buddha. Anyway, he writes here, and of course the language, of course, is not immediately gender inclusive, but it means man, means all human beings. That's taken source in consideration. Man, on the other hand, is a funny being who insists on considering everything he observes. He insists on considering everything he observes. He insists that he experience a world. He insists that he experience a world which in itself hangs together. He insists that he experience a world which in itself hangs together. It is a poetic idea. Any time that you create a poem, every element in it must be related to every other element. The poem must form a perfect whole if it is to be a good one. Everything in it must hang together, and so that is why we often call myths and mythic thinking mytho-poetic thinking. This is so because it is clear that the main roots of mythical thinking lie in poetry. And it is a very strange kind of poetry. It is a kind of poetry that pretends to truth. It wants to touch the truth, and so it takes itself to be the entire reality. It is not self-consciously poetical. Rather, it just is. It just is. Heinrich Blücher, I'll just say this. These are the kind of thinkers, though, that we are stepping into the auditorium of, so to speak, when we consider thinkers of the stature of Hannah Arendt and others that we have mentioned. Heinrich Blücher said this about Lao Tzu. Heinrich Blücher said, Lao Tzu has given to us something that no other thinker, well, the Buddha gave it to us in the Buddha's way. Socrates gave it to us in the Socratic way. Jesus gave it to us in the Jesus way. And Lao Tzu gives it to us in this way. Lao Tzu is the one who takes time and makes time the poetic idea. Time itself, the poetic idea. Why? Because Lao Tzu poetically has seen through the eyes of a poet so as to judge both being and non-being, so as to judge both of them in a creative sense of time, a sense of time that can include both being and non-being. And I just want to say then at this point, doesn't that remind you of Hannah Arendt speaking of St. Augustine as having taught her that love is that which gives peace to the will and weight to the soul so that it can step into the world of gravity and work with gravity in the things of time and space to create a work of thought? So does it not, in a sense, transfigure our sense of time, our sense of mental time? Our sense of time is in our attention and in the way we pay attention. I would think that Heinrich Blücher is saying that Lao Tzu gives us a sense of time which is so inspired because it allows us to understand that our quality of attention and of consideration, when we're considering the openings in the world of language, that this is the space of time given to us by thinkers of such inspiration as Lao Tzu and as Socrates and as Jesus and as Heinrich Blücher and as Hannah Arendt and Karl Jaspers, Martin Heidegger and St. Augustine and Rahel Vernhagen and all of these others and the worlds and the milieu in which they lived. So it is dedicated then to the space between us then. The democratic structures are there for us to create these forms to express that which is within us, which our wills and our souls need to find peace. Because, we are creatures of yes and no, and as such, we seek aletheia, we seek the truth, we seek wisdom in all of this. And so, at that note, I'll just read you one poem written by myself, because I have just a moment, and it will be just exactly the right time, to bring this thought to its, to its point where I speak of things like for now and stuff like that. And this poem is called Mobility of Calcium. It is about the way that the minerals are changing in these things, the components of these things are always moving in such a way that we do not notice in the outer form of it, but we can kind of come to understand it when we consider it like in relation to our own kind of the roots of our own thought that grows as it looks out and composes a world, because that's what we're doing and that's what we've always been doing. And it appears and forms in us in these ever-changing ways. This poem, then, written by myself, is called Mobility of Calcium. It says, mobility of calcium. It says, rest in the meaning of the words. They are cups into which the water of life is poured. Even splendid, stern things decay. Fire blossoms for a while, and soon is ash. Zero is a perfect circle. Nothing is what we are added onto. Nothing is what we are subtracted from. The rest is up to the meaning of the words and the hieroglyphic of your footprint as you journey over the world's roads. Worn away by life, you become life. Rain falls on rock for a while, rock dissolves, and then only rain. All I've got in my bony old hands are my empty palms, but they are cupped toward you. My offering, the road I walked to get here, the seeing of the feeling of it, the memory of it as it disappears, the sound of our voices as we watch it go. So always we bring our thoughts into these spaces. It enters the zone of transience, you might say, but there's so much else that is going on, as well as transience. And so let that reconfigure or transform our own sense of time and space, because we are building a world where such things are possible with our own creative thought. And Hannah Arendt empowers us, empowers our creative thought. And this is very good. It is very good that she has done this work. It is worth studying always. So that's the message then. And I thank you for your heroic listening. And then I say to you at this point, so long for now.